The Thompson family had called the same house home for as long as anyone could remember. 3 generations had grown up within those walls, each adding their own memories to the foundation. Margaret Thompson, 67 years old and retired from teaching, could still picture every room exactly as it was before everything changed. It was August 2005 when Hurricane Katrina started making headlines. At first it seemed like just another storm. Living on the Louisiana coast, the Thompsons were used to hurricane warnings. They'd weathered plenty of them before, riding out the wind and rain, then cleaning up afterward. But this time felt different. The weather reports grew more urgent with each passing hour. The officials weren't just suggesting evacuation anymore. They were demanding it. Margaret's daughter was 28 then, and she'd just had twin boys 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks? The babies were so tiny, so new to the world. They still had that fresh baby smell, and their eyes were just beginning to focus on faces. The thought of packing them up and fleeing seemed impossible, but staying seemed worse. Margaret's husband William had passed away 2 years before the storm. He'd been an Air Force pilot, the kind of man who stayed calm when everyone else panicked. Margaret missed him terribly, especially during moments like these when she needed his steady presence. His study still looked exactly as he'd left it, with his leather pilot's jacket hanging on the back of the door and his books lined up on the shelves. When the mandatory evacuation order came through, the family had maybe 4 or 5 hours to pack up and leave, 4 hours to decide what mattered most from an entire lifetime. It's a horrible thing having to choose. Do you grab the photo albums or the important documents? Do you take your grandmother's china or your children's baby clothes? Everything feels precious when you know you might never see it again. Margaret's daughter rushed around the house with the baby strapped to her chest in carriers, trying to gather their things. Diapers, formula, tiny clothes, the essentials for keeping 2 newborns alive. Margaret moved through the rooms like she was saying goodbye, touching the furniture, looking at the pictures on the walls. She wanted to take everything, but the car could only hold so much. In William's study, Margaret stood for a long moment. His leather journal sat on the desk where he used to write every evening. It was thick with years of entries, his neat handwriting filling page after page. He'd written about his time in Vietnam, about the planes he'd flown, about his thoughts on life and love. Next to it was a locked metal box she'd never paid much attention to. William had kept it in his desk drawer, and she'd always assumed it held military papers or old service records. Nothing she needed to disturb. She grabbed the journal, holding it close to her chest. At least she'd have his words. But there wasn't time for anything else. Her daughter was calling from downstairs. They needed to go, now. The photo album stayed on the shelf. Her daughter's wedding album, with its white leather cover and carefully arranged pictures, sat in the living room closet. The baby's hospital bracelets from their birth, those tiny plastic bands with their names and birth weights, were in a memory box upstairs. Margaret's own wedding photos from 1965, showing her and William young and impossibly hopeful, remained in their frames throughout the house. As they loaded the last bags into the car, Margaret ran back inside one final time. She grabbed a single photograph of William in his pilot's uniform, standing next to his aircraft. It was her favorite picture of him, the one that captured his quiet confidence and gentle smile. She slipped it into her purse and ran back to the car. The drive away from their home was surreal. Traffic clogged every road as thousands of people fled the coast. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, holding the babies in the back while her daughter drove. She kept looking in the side mirror, watching their neighborhood disappear behind them. The streets were flooding already, water creeping up driveways and lapping at front porches. She couldn't stop thinking about everything they'd left behind. William's journal was in her lap, but what about the rest? What about the metal box? What about all those photographs documenting their lives? What about the twins' hospital bracelets? Proof that they'd been born, that they'd entered this world on a specific day at a specific time. The storm hit with a fury nobody had really prepared for. Even the people who thought they understood hurricanes were shocked by Katrina's power. It didn't just damage the coast. It destroyed it. Entire neighborhoods vanished underwater. Houses were ripped from their foundations and scattered like toys. When the family was finally allowed to return weeks later, Margaret's heart sank before they even reached their street. The devastation was complete. Trees that had stood for decades were gone. Houses were reduced to piles of debris. And their home, the house that had held 3 generations of memories, was a hollow shell. The walls were still standing, but everything inside was destroyed. The water had risen above the first floor, soaking through everything, turning their belongings into sodden, ruined trash. The photographs were gone, dissolved into pulp. The furniture was warped and moldy. William's study was unrecognizable. His books swollen and destroyed, his desk collapsed. Margaret searched through the wreckage, hoping against hope to find something, anything that had survived. But there was nothing. The journal she'd grabbed was safe, tucked away in Texas where they'd evacuated to, but everything else was simply gone. The metal box, the photo albums, the wedding pictures, the baby's hospital things, all of it swept away by the storm. The family eventually made the painful decision not to rebuild. Too much was lost, and the coast felt different now, dangerous, unpredictable. They settled in Houston, starting over in a place that felt nothing like home. Margaret's daughter found work at a dental office. The twins started school. They made new friends, created new routines, built a new life. But some losses never really heal. Margaret would lie awake at night thinking about all those photographs she'd never see again, all those memories that existed now only in her mind, with no physical proof they'd ever happened. She'd think about William's metal box and wonder what he'd kept locked inside it. She'd never know now. 11 years passed. The twins grew into bright, energetic 11-year-olds. Life moved forward because that's what life does. The family adjusted to their new normal, though Margaret still kept that single photograph of William on her bedside table. It was all she had left of the man she'd loved for 40 years, and she treasured it. None of them could have imagined what was about to happen. None of them could have guessed that hundreds of miles away in the mountains of another state entirely, someone was about to make a discovery that would change everything, that a phone call was coming that would seem impossible, miraculous even, that the storm that took everything away had also set in motion a journey that defied all logic and reason. Sometimes, the things we lose find their way back, to us in the most unexpected ways. September 2016 started like any other month. Margaret's daughter was at the dental office where she worked, dealing with the usual Tuesday afternoon routine. Patients coming and going, phones ringing, the dentist running behind schedule. Nothing special, nothing unusual. Just another ordinary day in Houston, far removed from the life they'd left behind in Louisiana 11 years ago. Her phone rang during her lunch break. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. These days, unknown numbers usually meant spam calls or people trying to sell you something, but something made her pick up. Maybe curiosity. Maybe just boredom during a slow lunch hour. The voice on the other end was professional, friendly. Hello, I'm trying to reach the Thompson family. My name is David Martinez. I'm a commercial airline pilot based in Atlanta. Her first thought was that this was definitely some kind of scam. Why would a pilot be calling her? Was he trying to sell timeshares? Credit card miles? She almost hung up right there. But then he said something that made her freeze. I know this is going to sound strange, but I found some items that I believe belong to your family. A leather journal with the name Colonel William Thompson on it, and some photographs, and a metal box. The room seemed to tilt. She couldn't breathe for a second. What did you just say? David's voice remained calm and steady, the way pilots are trained to sound even in emergencies. I found these items several months ago while I was hiking in the Appalachian Mountains. They were wedged in a rock crevice near a stream, about 800 miles from Louisiana. I've been trying to track down the family ever since. 800 miles, from Louisiana to the Appalachian Mountains. That was impossible, wasn't it? I don't understand. How could anything travel that far? Hurricane Katrina, David said simply. I'm pretty sure these items were carried by the storm. The wind speeds were incredible, and with the flooding afterward, things could have traveled along water systems for miles. I know it sounds crazy, but I've done a lot of research on this. It's rare, but it happens. Margaret's daughter was shaking now. Her co-workers were starting to stare, probably wondering why she'd gone so pale. My father died before the hurricane. That journal, it was his. We lost it in the storm. We lost everything. I know, David said gently. I've spent months researching, trying to find you. I read through the journal, I hope you don't mind. Your father wrote his service number inside the cover. I used that to track down military records, and then I connected those to news reports about Katrina survivors. It took a while, but I finally found you. She was crying now, not even trying to hide it. Her co-workers had completely abandoned any pretense of not listening. Why would you go through all that trouble? You could have just kept them or thrown them away. There was a pause on the line. When David spoke again, his voice was softer, more personal. I'm a pilot too. Your father's writings, they meant something to me. The way he talked about flying, about fear and courage, about coming home to the people you love. I couldn't just put them in a storage box and forget about them. These aren't just objects. They're somebody's life, your life. You need to see this. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Where are you?
Can you mail them?
I'd rather bring them to you personally if that's okay. I want to make sure they get to you safely. I have a few days off next week. I could fly to Houston. After she hung up, she sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to process what had just happened. Then she called her mother. Margaret answered on the second ring, cheerful as always. Hi, sweetheart. How's work? Mom, you need to sit down. The tone in her daughter's voice must have triggered something because Margaret's response was immediate and worried. What's wrong? Are the boys okay? The boys are fine. Everyone's fine. But Mom, someone found Dad's journal and his metal box. The ones we lost in the storm. Silence. Complete silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, she thought the call had dropped. Mom? When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. That's not possible. A pilot found them. In the mountains. He's been looking for us for months. He wants to bring them here. Margaret started crying. Not quiet tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere deep inside. From a place that's been locked away for 11 years. The kind of crying that happens when you've accepted something is gone forever. And then suddenly, impossibly, it isn't. The next 2 weeks crawled by. Margaret couldn't sleep. She'd lie awake at night, wondering what William had written in those pages she'd never read. They'd been married for nearly 40 years, but she'd never looked at his journal. It was his private space, his way of processing the world. She'd always respected that. But now she'd get to read his words again, hear his voice in her head. The metal box haunted her thoughts even more. What had William kept locked inside it? Why had he never told her about it? They'd shared everything. At least she thought they had. What secrets had he kept locked away? Her daughter was a mess too, snapping at coworkers, distracted with patients. The twins noticed something was up. They kept asking what was wrong, why Grandma was acting so strange. But how do you explain to 11-year-olds that pieces of their grandfather's life, pieces that had been swept away by a hurricane before they were born, were somehow coming back? Finally, the day arrived. David had texted that morning. He'd landed in Houston, rented a car, and was heading to Margaret's apartment. The whole family gathered there, waiting. Margaret kept pacing, straightening things that didn't need to be straightened, checking her reflection in the mirror. What if it's not really his stuff? She said suddenly. What if this man is mistaken? Her daughter squeezed her hand. Mom, he read the journal. He knew Dad's name, his rank, his service number. It's real. The doorbell rang. Margaret gasped, actually gasped like people do in movies. Her daughter went to answer it while Margaret stood frozen in the middle of the living room. David Martinez was younger than they'd expected, maybe in his early 40s. He had kind eyes and an easy smile, the kind of person you'd trust instantly. He was carrying a weathered backpack that looked like it had seen better days. Mrs. Thompson, he said, extending his hand to Margaret. She couldn't speak. She just nodded. David carefully set the backpack on the coffee table and unzipped it. The first thing he pulled out was the leather journal. Even from across the room, Margaret recognized it. The color, the size, the way the corners were worn from William's habit of holding it while he thought. She moved forward like she was in a dream, reaching out with shaking hands. The moment her fingers touched the leather, she broke down completely. It smelled like him somehow. After 11 years, after being lost in a storm and traveling hundreds of miles and sitting in mountain rocks, it still smelled like her husband. David stepped back, giving her space. Her daughter had her arms around her, both of them crying. The twins stood awkwardly to the side, not quite understanding but sensing this was something important, something sacred. There's more, David said quietly. Margaret sat on the couch, clutching the journal against her chest like it might disappear if she let go. Her fingers traced the embossed initials on the cover, the same ones she'd watched William touch countless times over the years. She couldn't believe it was real. After 11 years of thinking it was gone forever, here it was, solid and real in her hands. David reached into the backpack again. This time he pulled out a stack of photographs protected in a plastic sleeve. They were water-stained around the edges, the colors slightly faded, but they were intact, recognizable, real. Margaret's daughter took them first, her hands trembling as she flipped through the stack. Then she actually gasped out loud. Mom, look at this, it was their wedding photo. Margaret and William, young and radiant, standing outside a small church in 1965. Margaret was wearing the simple white dress her mother had made by hand. William was in his dress uniform, looking sharp and proud. They were both smiling like they had the whole world figured out. Margaret took the photo with shaking hands. She hadn't seen this picture in 11 years. She'd tried so hard to remember exactly how they looked that day, but memories fade. Details blur. Now here it was. Proof that the day had happened, that they'd been that young and hopeful once. There's more, her daughter whispered, still flipping through the stack. Baby pictures. Photos of her as an infant, chubby-cheeked and happy. Pictures Margaret thought she'd never see again. There were birthday parties and Christmas mornings and random Tuesday afternoons that someone had thought to capture on film. Then her daughter found her own wedding photos, the ones from her marriage years ago. She'd grieved for these almost as much as anything else they'd lost. Her special day, documented and preserved and then gone. But here they were, her in her wedding dress, her father walking her down the aisle, the cake cutting, the first dance. All of it had survived somehow. The twins crowded closer, curious now. Is that you, Mom? One of them asked, pointing at the wedding photo. Yeah, baby, that's me. You look pretty. She laughed through her tears. Thank you, sweetheart. Then they found the hospital photos. The twins as newborns, tiny and red-faced, wrapped in those standard-issue hospital blankets with the pink and blue stripes. They were only 3 weeks old when the hurricane hit. Margaret's daughter had been so exhausted, so overwhelmed with 2 infants, that she'd barely had time to look at these photos before they had to evacuate. That's us? The other twin asked, squinting at the pictures. That's you guys. Brand new. The boys looked at each other, grinning. There's something special about seeing yourself as a baby. Proof that you were once that small, that helpless, that new to the world. David had been standing quietly by the door, letting them have their moment. But now he spoke up again. There's one more thing. The metal box. He pulled it from the backpack carefully. It was bigger than Margaret had remembered, or maybe it just seemed that way now. The metal was scratched and dented, but intact. The Air Force insignia was still visible on the top. And most importantly, it was still locked. Margaret stared at it. I never knew what was inside. William never told me. You never asked? Her daughter said, surprised. He kept it in his desk drawer. I figured it was military paperwork or old service documents. Things that mattered to him but wouldn't mean much to me. I never thought to pry. David set the box on the coffee table. I didn't want to force it open. It seemed wrong somehow, like it should be your choice. Margaret reached out and touched the lock. It was a combination lock, 3 numbers. She had no idea what the code might be. William had never mentioned it. I don't know how to open it. Her daughter leaned forward. Try his birthday, Margaret tried. Nothing. Your birthday? Nothing. Your anniversary? Still nothing. They tried every significant date they could think of. The day William enlisted. The day he came home from Vietnam. The day he retired. The day her daughter was born. Nothing worked. We could drill it open, David suggested gently. A locksmith could do it without damaging what's inside too much. But Margaret shook her head. No, he locked it for a reason. If we force it open, it feels like we're violating something, like we're breaking a promise I didn't even know I made. They sat in frustrated silence for a few minutes. The box sat there on the table, keeping its secrets, so close but still unreachable. Maybe we're not supposed to open it right now, Margaret's daughter said finally. Maybe we should just be grateful for what we got back. Margaret nodded slowly. She picked up the journal instead, opening it to a random page. William's handwriting filled the lines, neat and precise. She started reading, and immediately his voice filled her head. The way he phrased things, the words he chose, it was so completely him that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Would you mind if I read some of it out loud? She asked. Please, her daughter said. The twins settled on the floor, surprisingly quiet and attentive. Margaret cleared her throat and began reading. It was an entry from 1972, just after her daughter was born. William wrote about holding his baby girl for the first time, about how terrified he was of doing something wrong, of being a bad father. He wrote about watching Margaret sleep in the hospital bed, exhausted but beautiful and feeling like the luckiest man alive. He wrote about his hopes for the future, about wanting to see his daughter grow up, graduate, get married, have kids of her own, about wanting to be there for all of it, to be the kind of father who showed up and stayed present and loved unconditionally. Margaret's daughter was crying openly now. "I didn't know he wrote about me." "He wrote about you all the time, sweetheart. You were his whole world." Margaret kept reading, flipping through entries at random. There were stories from Vietnam, philosophical thoughts about courage and fear, observations about flying and what it felt like to be suspended between earth and sky. There were love letters to Margaret, pages and pages of them, copies he'd apparently kept of letters he'd sent her during his deployments. The twins listened, fascinated. This grandfather they'd never met was becoming real to them through his own words. They heard about his sense of humor, his worries, his dreams. He wasn't just a name anymore or a person in old photographs. He was becoming three-dimensional. David watched from his spot by the door, a small smile on his face. This was why he'd spent months tracking them down. This right here, this moment of connection, of healing, of something lost being found again. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret kept coming back to the metal box. She'd read for a while, then glance at it, then read some more. It was like an itch she couldn't scratch. What had William kept locked away? Why had he never mentioned it? Finally, as evening approached, she picked up the journal again and decided to read it chronologically. Start from the beginning and work her way through. Maybe she'd find a clue somewhere. The early entries were from Vietnam, William's observations about war, about flying combat missions, about missing home. Then entries from after he returned, adjusting to civilian life, falling deeper in love with Margaret. Their wedding, buying their first house. The ordinary and extraordinary moments of a life being lived. Then she reached April 1972, the month her daughter was born. William's handwriting on these pages was messier, excited, like he couldn't write fast enough to capture his feelings. He described the birth, the first time he held his daughter, the overwhelming love and terror of being responsible for another human life. And then, at the end of that entry, he wrote something that made Margaret's heart skip. "Today my whole world changed. My new combination 041272. Her hand started shaking. April 12, 1972, her daughter's birthday. The day William became a father, of course. Of course, that's what he'd chosen. "Hand me the box," she whispered. Her daughter passed it over, confused. Margaret set it in her lap and slowly, carefully dialed in the numbers. 041272. The lock clicked. The room went completely silent. Even the twins seemed to understand this was important. Margaret's hands hovered over the lid, suddenly terrified of what she might find. What if it was disappointing? What if it was something that changed how she remembered him? Her daughter put a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Mom. Whatever it is, it's from him. It's meant for you." Margaret took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside the box, everything was wrapped in oilcloth, protected and preserved. Margaret's hands trembled as she carefully unwrapped the first layer. The fabric was old, but had done its job. Whatever William had sealed inside had been kept safe from water and time. The first things she found were papers. Official-looking papers with fancy borders and seals. She pulled one out and stared at it, not quite understanding at first. Then her daughter leaned over her shoulder and gasped, "Mom, those are savings bonds." Margaret spread them out on the coffee table. 20 of them. Each one made out to the same two names. The twins' names. The boys who weren't born until 3 years after William died. The grandsons he never got to meet. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered. How did he know? How could he possibly know their names? Her daughter picked up one of the bonds, examining it closely. "These are from the 80s and 90s. He bought them years before the boys were born. He just chose those names." "They were his favorite names," Margaret said, the memory flooding back. "When you were little, he used to say if he ever had grandsons, that's what he'd want them to be called. I thought he was just daydreaming." "I never thought—" The twins were staring at the bonds with wide eyes. "What are savings bonds?" one of them asked. "They're like money that grows over time," their mother explained. "Grandpa bought these for you before you were even born. Before I even knew I'd have kids." David, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "Those bonds have been maturing for decades. They're probably worth quite a bit now." Margaret's daughter did some quick math in her head, checking the dates and values. Her eyes went wide. Mom, these are worth almost $40,000. The room went silent again. $40,000. Money that William had set aside for grandchildren he'd never meet, using names he'd simply hoped someone might have someday. It was like he'd reached across time itself to take care of his family. But there was more in the box. Margaret pulled out a sealed envelope next. Her name was written across the front in William's handwriting, and underneath it said, "To be opened when you need to hear my voice again." Her hands shook so badly she could barely break the seal. Her daughter had to help her. Inside were several pages, both sides covered in William's careful writing. Margaret's vision blurred with tears before she even started reading. "Would you read it, sweetheart?" she asked, handing the letter to her daughter. "I don't think I can." Her daughter took the letter, clearing her throat. She had to stop several times to compose herself, but she made it through. William had written it in 2002, during a bad bout of pneumonia that had landed him in the hospital. He must have known his time was running short, that his body wasn't bouncing back the way it used to. The letter talked about their life together. Every anniversary, every argument, every moment of joy and hardship. He wrote about watching Margaret become a teacher, how proud he was of the way she shaped young minds. He wrote about their daughter, about watching her grow from a baby into a woman, about the pride that sometimes made his chest ache. He wrote about regrets, too. Times he'd been deployed when he should have been home. Moments he'd been too tired or too distracted to really listen. Words he'd said in anger that he wished he could take back. But mostly he wrote about gratitude. For every day he got to spend with Margaret. For every ordinary moment that made up their extraordinary life together. The letter ended with instructions. "If you're reading this," William wrote, "then somehow this box survived whatever took me from your side. Take it as a sign, my darling Margaret, that some bonds cannot be broken by time, distance, or even death. Use what I've saved to create new memories. Let our grandsons know their grandfather believed in preparing for the future, even one he wouldn't see. And please, my love, find joy again. Find laughter. Find reasons to wake up smiling. You were my reason for everything, and I want to be yours for choosing happiness even after I'm gone." By the time her daughter finished reading, everyone in the room was crying. Even David had tears streaming down his face. The twins huddled close to their grandmother, not fully understanding everything but sensing the weight of the moment. Margaret held the letter to her chest, rocking slightly. "I miss him so much," she whispered. "Every single day I miss him." But there was still more in the box. A small jewelry case that Margaret recognized immediately. She opened it with shaking hands and found her grandmother's pearl necklace inside, the one she thought had been lost in the storm. The one that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. William must have put it in the box for safekeeping at some point, and she'd never known. "I can't believe he saved this," she breathed, lifting the pearls from their case. They gleamed softly in the lamplight, perfect and beautiful. "My grandmother wore these on her wedding day. My mother wore them on hers. I wore them on mine." She looked at her daughter. "And you were supposed to wear them on yours, but we lost them before your wedding." "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." Her daughter was crying again. "It's okay, Mom, it's okay. We have them now." At the very bottom of the box was one more item, a small USB drive wrapped carefully in tissue paper. David perked up at this. "I have my laptop in the car. Want me to grab it?" Minutes later, they were all huddled around David's computer as it read the drive. A folder popped up with dozens of video files, each one labeled with a date. Margaret clicked on the first one with trembling hands. William's face filled the screen. He was sitting in his study, the camera obviously propped up on something. He looked directly into the lens, directly at them, and smiled. "Hello, my loves," he said, and Margaret sobbed out loud. His voice. His actual voice, not just in her memory, but real and present. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone. And I'm so sorry I couldn't stay longer." The video was several minutes long. William talked about his love for his family, shared some of his favorite memories, told a few of his terrible dad jokes that had always made them groan. He looked healthy in the video, recorded before he'd gotten really sick, and seeing him like that, so alive and vibrant, was almost too much to bear. But they watched it all the way through. And then they watched the next one. And the next. There were videos addressed to Margaret specifically, talking about their life together, reminiscing about trips they'd taken and dreams they'd shared. There were videos for his daughter, filled with fatherly advice and pride and unconditional love. and there were videos for grandsons he'd never met. William looked into the camera and talked to these hypothetical future boys, telling them about their family history, about what it means to be a good man, about the importance of kindness and courage and showing up for the people you love. The twins watched their grandfather speak directly to them, even though he'd died before they were born. They listened to his stories about flying, about serving his country, about falling in love with their grandmother. They heard his voice and his laugh, and he became real to them in a way he'd never been before. "He looks like you," one of the twins whispered to their grandmother. Margaret smiled through her tears. "You think so?" "Yeah, around the eyes." They watched videos until the sun went down and Margaret's living room was lit only by the glow of the laptop screen. David ordered pizza for everyone, and they ate while William's face smiled at them from the screen, his voice filling the apartment with warmth and love and presence. It was late when they finally finished the last video. The twins had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. Margaret sat in her chair, the pearl necklace in her hands, the journal in her lap, surrounded by photographs and memories and proof that love doesn't end when life does. David started packing up his laptop, preparing to head to his hotel. But Margaret stopped him. "Wait, please, I need to know something. Why did you really do all this? It must have taken so much time, so much effort. Why did you care so much about returning things to strangers?" David was quiet for a moment. Then he sat back down. David sat back down, and for the first time since arriving, he looked uncomfortable, vulnerable. He stared at his hands for a long moment before speaking. 2 years ago, I had a really bad incident while landing a plane, he said quietly. We hit severe turbulence, lost an engine, and I had to emergency land with 200 passengers on board. Everyone survived. I did my job, but afterward I couldn't shake it. I'd wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, convinced I was falling. I'd be in the cockpit and suddenly feel like I couldn't breathe. Margaret leaned forward, listening intently. Her daughter had woken up too, drawn back into the conversation. I started having panic attacks, David continued. Real ones. The kind where you think you're dying. I couldn't tell anyone because I was terrified they'd ground me, take away my license. Flying is all I've ever known. It's who I am. But I was scared all the time. Scared I'd freeze up in the cockpit. Scared I'd make a mistake and people would die because of me. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes red. I found your husband's journal on a Sunday morning last year. I'd gone hiking to clear my head, maybe to figure out if I could keep flying or if I needed to quit. And there it was, wedged in these rocks like it had been waiting for me. I sat down right there on the trail and started reading. Your husband wrote about Vietnam, about flying combat missions where people were actively trying to shoot him down. He wrote about being terrified every single time he climbed into that cockpit. But he also wrote about why he kept doing it anyway. About the people counting on him. About how courage isn't the absence of fear, it's flying anyway. David's voice cracked. There was this one entry where he talked about a particularly bad mission. He was so scared he almost refused to fly. But he wrote, the people in the plane behind me don't need a fearless pilot. They need a pilot who shows up even when he's afraid. That line saved my life, or at least it saved my career. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. William would have been proud to know his words helped someone. That's why I had to find you, David said. I couldn't just keep the journal. It felt like I was borrowing something precious, something that needed to go home. And the more I read, the more I understood that these weren't just objects. They were proof of a life well lived. Proof that love matters. That the things we leave behind matter. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Margaret's daughter spoke up. You know what? I'm going to share this story online. People need to hear about this, and she did. She wrote a post that night about the hurricane, the lost items, and the pilot who'd spent months tracking them down. She posted photos of the journal, the recovered pictures, and even included a clip from one of William's videos. She thought maybe a few friends would see it. Instead, the post went viral. Within days, news outlets were calling. Local stations, then national ones. Everyone wanted to know about the items that had traveled 800 miles, survived 11 years, and found their way home through the determination of a stranger. The story was impossible and beautiful, and exactly what people needed to hear in a world that often felt too harsh. David became an unexpected celebrity. Passengers recognized him on flights. People stopped him in airports to shake his hand. He was embarrassed by all the attention, insisting he'd just done what anyone would do. But Margaret knew better. Most people wouldn't have spent months researching. Most people wouldn't have cared enough to try. The Thompson family story resonated with Hurricane Katrina survivors across the country. Margaret started getting letters from people who'd lost everything in the storm, people who said her story gave them hope. Some had also recovered lost items years later, in strange and unexpected places. Others just wanted to share their own stories of loss and resilience. The twins asked if they could use some of the money from the savings bonds to help other hurricane survivors. They'd been learning about Katrina in school and were shocked by how many people were still struggling, still displaced, still grieving over a decade later. Margaret and her daughter were so proud they could hardly speak. They donated $10,000 to a charity that helped Katrina survivors rebuild their lives. The organization was overwhelmed by the gift and the story behind it. They featured the Thompson family in their newsletter, and more donations poured in from people inspired by the gesture. Margaret had the journal professionally restored. Some pages were damaged beyond repair, but most of William's words were saved. A military history magazine asked if they could publish excerpts, and Margaret agreed. She received letters from dozens of veterans who found comfort in William's honest words about fear and courage, about war and coming home, about finding meaning in service. One veteran wrote, "I've been struggling with my memories for 40 years. Your husband's journal helped me understand I'm not weak for being afraid. Thank you for sharing him with us." Margaret also commissioned a painting based on one of the recovered photographs, the one of young William standing beside his aircraft, confident and strong. She donated it to the Air Force Museum with a plaque explaining its remarkable journey. Visitors now stopped to read about the journal and metal box that survived a hurricane, traveled 800 miles and came home through the kindness of a stranger. David became like family. He visited several times a year, always bringing stories from his travels. The twins loved hearing about all the places he'd flown, all the people he'd met. He taught them about aviation, showing them the same passion for flying that their grandfather had felt. 1 year after finding the items, David took the whole family back to the spot in the Appalachian Mountains where he'd made the discovery. They hiked up together, Margaret moving slowly but determined. When they reached the place, they stood looking at the rocks, the stream, the trees, trying to imagine how William's belongings had ended up there. They placed a small stone memorial in the spot. It was simple, just a flat rock with words carved into it. Some things are meant to find their way home. They'd taken the phrase from William's journal, from an entry about returning from deployment. Margaret brought flowers and placed them beside the stone. Her daughter took pictures. The twins skipped rocks in the stream, their laughter echoing off the mountains. And David stood back, watching this family he'd helped bring back together, feeling like maybe his rough landing 2 years ago had happened for a reason. Maybe he was supposed to find that journal. Maybe the whole thing was meant to be. Back in Houston, Margaret kept the journal on her nightstand. Every night before bed, she read one entry. Some made her laugh. Some made her cry. All of them made her feel close to William again, like he was still there with her somehow, still sharing his thoughts and dreams and fears. Her daughter created a gallery wall in her home with all the recovered photographs. She called it the journey back. Friends and family would come over and stare at it in wonder, asking about the story behind each picture. And every time she told the tale, it felt a little bit like a miracle. The twins grew up knowing their grandfather through his own words and videos. They joined their high school aviation club, both fascinated by flying. They said it made them feel connected to the grandfather they'd never met, to the man who'd somehow known their names before they were born, who'd saved for their future without ever seeing their faces. The metal box stayed on Margaret's mantle, a reminder of everything they'd lost and found again. Sometimes she'd just sit and look at it, marveling at the impossibility of it all. The storm that destroyed everything also set in motion a journey that brought the most important pieces back. She thought about all the forces that had to align for this to happen. The wind patterns that carried William's things exactly 800 miles, the rocks that caught and protected them, David choosing that particular trail on that particular Sunday, him being a pilot, someone who'd understand the significance of William's words, him caring enough to search for months, all of it impossible, all of it real. On the 11th anniversary of finding the items, Margaret sat in her living room surrounded by her family. The twins were tall now, almost young men. Her daughter looked more like Margaret every year. David was there too, having arranged his schedule so he could be with them. They watched William's videos again, the way they did every year on this date. And even though they'd seen them dozens of times, they still laughed at his jokes, still teared up at his tender moments, still felt grateful for every word. Margaret wore her grandmother's pearls. She'd started wearing them regularly, deciding that keeping them safe in a box was pointless. They were meant to be worn, to be lived in, to be part of life rather than hidden away. "Thank you," she said to David like she did every year. "Thank you for bringing him back to us." And David smiled like he always did and said, "Thank you for letting me be part of your family," because that's what they'd become. A family bound not by blood but by circumstance, by a hurricane and a journal and a metal box, by kindness and persistence and the simple fact that some people care enough to do the right thing even when it's hard. The storm had taken so much, but in taking, it had also given. It had sent William's words on a journey that led a struggling pilot back to himself. It had preserved memories that brought comfort to strangers. It had created connections between people who would never have met otherwise. Margaret looked around at her family, at the photographs on the walls, at the journal that had traveled so far to come home. And she understood what William had meant in his letter. Some bonds really couldn't be broken, not by distance, not by time, not even by death. Love finds a way. It always finds a way home.